Imagine walking out to your family's generational ranch in the crisp morning light, only to hear the violent, shrieking roar of heavy commercial excavators chewing up your grazing pasture, not to build a utility line, but to steal your private water supply for an arrogant suburban neighborhood. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this is the ultimate story of malicious compliance, and watching entitled HOA bullies get completely destroyed by property law has never been this satisfying. When I rushed across the dew-soaked grass that morning, demanding to know what absolute madness was going on, the lead contractor just pointed a gloved finger at a sleek white luxury SUV idling by the fence line. Out stepped Brenda, the self-appointed tyrant of the newly constructed luxury housing development bordering my land, wearing an expensive designer suit and a look of cold, unadulterated corporate malice. "You need to move your livestock immediately," Brenda announced, her voice dripping with venom. "The Whispering Pines HOA board has officially authorized an auxiliary utility trench. Your pasture is obstructing our community water pressure." She was actually attempting to hijack my family's private land for a subdivision water project. Welcome to the absolute peak of HOA insanity, where suburban developers and power-tripping residents treat the rest of the world like their personal municipal playground. To understand how a quiet rural rancher ended up locked in a high-stakes legal war with a suburban Karen, you have to go back to when Whispering Pines was first thrown together over a year ago. For decades, our borders were defined by thick oak trees, open pastures, and absolute peace. But then, a massive real estate conglomerate bought out the old dairy farm next door, clear-cut the timber, and erected 80 cookie-cutter luxury homes. Along with those homes came a very specific breed of resident, people who traded city life for the suburbs and instantly brought their aggressive, hyper-controlling HOA culture right along with them. They planted manicured lawns requiring industrial amounts of water. They installed uniform mailboxes. And most dangerously, they elected Brenda as their president. Brenda operated with the relentless force and brute power of a grizzly bear, completely flattening anyone who dared to question her absolute authority. She patrolled the neighborhood with a clipboard, hunting down minor violations like a hawk. The only problem? My farm wasn't part of Whispering Pines. My property line was established back in 1912. I never signed their CCRs. I never paid a dime of their monthly dues. Yet Brenda looked at my century-old family farm and decided it was an inconvenient speed bump to her subdivision's water expansion. It started with polite, condescending notes left in my mailbox, demanding access to our underground well systems. Then came formal warning letters claiming our historical water rights were interfering with community growth. And finally, when I ignored their paper threats, they decided to bypass permission altogether and take matters into their own hands with heavy machinery. They were trying to steal our water infrastructure. Most people would have thrown the letters straight into the trash. I did too, for the first 3 notices. But Brenda wasn't someone who backed down when ignored. When she realized I wasn't going to play ball or hand over our utility access, she escalated the situation in a way that crossed every single legal boundary imaginable. It happened on a bright, freezing Tuesday morning. I looked out my kitchen window and saw a massive backhoe digging a deep, ugly trench directly across my grazing pasture, heading straight toward our primary livestock water line. My heart did a hard, cold flip in my chest. I grabbed my coffee mug, pushed open the heavy wooden screen door, and stepped out onto the porch. "What do you think you're doing?" I called out, my voice cutting sharply across the open field. Brenda slowly turned around. She didn't look guilty. She looked triumphant. "You've been given multiple warnings," she declared, lifting her chin with absolute arrogance. "The Whispering Pines board needs that water line rerouted for our new community landscaping project. Your farming days right next to our development are over." She was actually ordering my private utility lines destroyed. She thought she was completely untouchable. But what Brenda didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have factored into her delusional math, was that sitting right inside my kitchen, watching this entire illegal destruction stunt unfold through the window, was the county's chief land surveyor, who had just arrived with a stack of historical deeds and utility blueprints. The heavy wooden screen door of my farmhouse swung back with a sharp, echoing crack that cut straight through the low rumble of idling diesel engines and heavy steel tracks biting into the pasture dirt. Marcus stepped out onto the porch. He wasn't wearing a hard hat or holding a clipboard. He had on his usual faded canvas field jacket, mud-caked boots, and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. To Brenda, who was completely blinded by her own suburban privilege, he looked like nothing more than an unpolished farmhand or a hired helper. She didn't even blink in his direction. Her eyes remained locked on me, gleaming with the self-righteous satisfaction of a corporate tyrant executing a master plan. "Is there an issue here?" Marcus asked, his voice low, steady, and dangerously calm as he slowly descended the weathered wooden porch steps. Brenda let out a sharp, dismissive huff, waving a laminated utility blueprint dismissively in the air. "There is no issue for you to concern yourself with, farmhand. This parcel has been designated by the Whispering Pines Architectural Committee as an auxiliary municipal utility corridor. The excavation order is fully authorized by our neighborhood master covenant." Marcus didn't stop walking until he reached the edge of the churned-up pasture grass. He cast a slow, deliberate glance at the massive yellow backhoe chewing 50 feet into my topsoil, its metal bucket dripping with wet earth. Then he looked down at the bright red utility flags hammered straight into my clover field, cutting right through my historical waterline markers. Finally, he turned his gaze back to Brenda. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his tone perfectly even, "did you pull the county deed and an independent utility easement survey on this specific parcel before you authorized heavy machinery on private agricultural dirt?" Brenda scoffed, planting her hands firmly on her hips. Her designer suit jacket stretched tight as she squared her shoulders in absolute disgust. "I don't need an independent survey. I am the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Our master developer provided these blueprints, and our legal jurisdiction covers every square inch of land adjacent to our perimeter wall." The lead backhoe operator, a weathered guy in a neon-reflective vest, shifted uncomfortably near the metal tracks. He leaned out of the open cab, staring nervously between Brenda and Marcus. "Look, lady," the operator interjected, his voice tight with hesitation. "Are you 100% sure this land isn't privately deeded? My company doesn't tear up private pasture without county sign-off. It's a massive legal liability if we hit an unmarked private utility line." Brenda whirled around to face the operator, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "I am telling you for the absolute last time I take full legal responsibility. Drop that bucket and rip that trench open, Rig. ACT now, or I will ensure the Whispering Pines HOA blacklists your construction firm from every single commercial development in this county." The operator swallowed hard, gripped his control levers, and bit his lower lip. The massive hydraulic arm of the backhoe hissed to life, and the heavy steel bucket lowered another few inches toward the rich soil directly above my main water feed. I took a slow step forward, my hand resting casually in my jacket pocket. If that bucket cracked my primary water line, my entire livestock operation would be left bone dry in the middle of summer. Before I could even open my mouth to issue a final warning, Marcus stepped directly into the path of the operating machinery. He didn't yell, he didn't rush. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his canvas field jacket, pulled out a thick leather folio, and flipped it open with a sharp, authoritative snap of his wrist. The polished gold medallion of the county chief land surveyor caught the bright morning light, flashing like a warning beacon over the grass. "Shut the engine down," Marcus commanded. The operator froze mid-motion, his hand hovering inches above the hydraulic controls. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him staring in absolute shock at the official government seal. "Chief," the operator choked out, his eyes glued to the gold badge. "Oh, man, I didn't know." "You're about to find out," Marcus replied coldly. Brenda, however, was entirely immune to reality. Her ego was so massive, so completely detached from municipal law, that she marched right up to Marcus and shoved a manicured finger right into his chest. "Put that fake prop away," Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. "I don't care who you think you are. You are trespassing on an authorized neighborhood development zone. I'm calling the county sheriff right now, and I'm having both of you arrested for obstruction of community progress." Marcus looked down at her finger, then up into her wild, frantic eyes. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. "You want to call the sheriff, Brenda?" Marcus asked softly. "Good, because you won't even have to dial." He reached to his belt, keyed his heavy-duty handheld county radio, and spoke 3 words that changed the entire atmosphere of the morning. "Unit 4, roll up to the north pasture. We have an active property destruction in progress." From down the access road, through the open fields, the sharp, wailing siren of a county cruiser suddenly cut through the air. Brenda's triumphant smirk finally faltered, but instead of backing down, she did something that completely defied all human logic. Part 3, the wail of the approaching siren bounced off the old timber fence line and echoed across the open fields. To any normal person, the sound of flashing red and blue lights tearing down a dirt farm road meant one thing: the game was completely over. But Brenda wasn't normal. She was an HOA president, a woman who genuinely believed her multi-million-dollar master deed superseded municipal law, county surveys, and basic water rights. Instead of stepping back from the path of the excavator, she spun around and glared furiously at the terrified equipment operator. "Don't you dare cut that engine!" she screamed, her voice cracking over the heavy diesel rumble. "I am paying your company top dollar. Tear that trench open right now, or I will personally ensure your contracting license is revoked across the entire state." The operator looked from Brenda to Marcus's gleaming gold badge, and then back to the steel bucket of his massive machine. He didn't hesitate for even a microsecond. "Lady, you're completely out of your mind," the operator snapped. He threw his control levers into neutral, slammed the emergency kill switch, and scrambled out of the open cab, leaping down onto the dirt. "I'm not catching a federal property destruction and felony and losing my business for a suburban tyrant." He hurled his heavy yellow hard hat onto the ground, cursed under his breath, and began walking rapidly toward his flatbed trailer. Brenda stood entirely alone in the churned-up grass, her mouth dropping open in absolute disbelief as her construction crew abandoned her in broad daylight. "Cowards!" she shrieked, stamping her designer heel into the dirt. A split second later, a marked county sheriff's cruiser fishtailed off the asphalt access road, kicking up a massive wall of brown dust before slamming to a halt right behind the idle backhoe. The door flew open, and Deputy Miller stepped out into the morning sun, his hand resting securely on his duty belt, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. Brenda's face instantly lit up. The blind panic vanished, replaced once again by that toxic, manufactured sense of supreme entitlement. She thought the cavalry had finally arrived to rescue her. She marched right up to Deputy Miller, waving her arms in the air like a frantic air traffic controller. "Officer, thank heavens!" she cried out, putting on a masterclass of fake victimhood. "You need to arrest these 2 men immediately. They are trespassing on our community's designated utility zone, and they just harassed our legally contracted workers." Deputy Miller blinked against the morning glare. He looked at Brenda. Then he looked past her, spotting Marcus standing tall by the porch, and me leaning casually against the railing. Miller's gaze shifted to Marcus's gleaming badge. The color drained entirely from the deputy's face. The bright morning sunlight seemed to matter a whole lot less as the gravity of who he was looking at completely took over. "Chief," Miller muttered, his voice tight and formal, as he snapped straight to attention. "What's going on here, sir?" Brenda paused, her arms still raised mid-gesture. The sheer dissonance of the deputy addressing the unkempt, flannel-wearing farmhand as Chief finally short-circuited her brain. "What are you calling him that for?" Brenda shrieked, her voice pitching up into a frantic squeak. "Arrest them! I am the president of Whispering Pines. My master deed is law in this district." Marcus didn't blink. He took one slow step forward through the grass, his eyes locking onto Brenda with cold, absolute authority. "Deputy Miller," Marcus said quietly, every word cutting like glass through the morning air. "Take this suspect into custody for criminal mischief and attempted destruction of private agricultural property." Miller didn't hesitate. He unclipped his steel handcuffs, stepped around Brenda's frozen form, and grabbed her arm. "Ma'am, turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller ordered. For a fraction of a second, Brenda stared at the cold steel cuffs as if they were an optical illusion. Then, the realization of what was actually happening hit her like a freight train. She violently wrenched her arm out of Miller's grip. "Do not touch me!" she screamed, her mask of composure shattering completely. "You cannot arrest me. You don't know who I am. I own this entire valley." And right then, in front of a county deputy, Brenda made the absolute worst mistake of her entire life. With a blind, feral shriek of pure rage, she wound up her arm and slapped Deputy Miller squarely across the face. The sharp, echoing smack sounded like a gunshot over the quiet hum of the countryside. The entire pasture went dead silent. Even the birds in the nearby trees seemed to stop singing. You do not strike a law enforcement officer. But you never strike a deputy in front of the chief land surveyor who controls every boundary marker, deed, and utility line in the county. The silence that followed the slap was heavier than the summer heat pressing down on the fields. Brenda stood frozen with her hands still raised in the air, her chest heaving as she finally realized the catastrophic mistake she had just made. She had just assaulted a sworn county deputy on private agricultural land, right in front of the county's chief land surveyor. Deputy Miller didn't even flinch. He didn't yell, and he didn't lose his temper. He simply wiped his cheek, his eyes narrowing into cold, unforgiving slits. Before Brenda could open her mouth to stutter an excuse, Miller moved with lightning speed. He grabbed her arm, spun her around with practiced efficiency, and slammed her against the hood of his sheriff's cruiser. The harsh, metallic click of the steel handcuffs ratcheting tight around her wrists sounded like a death knell for her suburban empire. "Let me go!" Brenda shrieked, her designer suit jacket scraping against the police car as she thrashed uselessly. "This is police brutality. The Whispering Pines HOA is going to sue this entire county into bankruptcy. You can't do this to me." Marcus walked up slowly, resting his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket. He looked down at her with a calm, unbothered expression. "Brenda, you started out with a civil trespassing dispute," Marcus said quietly. "Then you upgraded it to attempted property destruction. And now you've secured yourself a felony charge for assaulting a peace officer." Tears of pure, unadulterated fury began streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing that her multi-million-dollar subdivision and her laminated utility blueprints couldn't save her anymore. "You're making a massive mistake," she sobbed, her voice cracking as Miller hoisted her upward and opened the back door of the cruiser. "You'll never get away with her." "Assing our neighborhood. The entire board will have your badges by sundown." She thought the Whispering Pines Board of Directors was her personal militia. She thought they would rally behind her, pool their money, and wage an endless legal war to avenge their fearless leader. What Brenda didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have factored into her delusional math, was that the Whispering Pines HOA board was about to discover a horrifying truth. Because the moment Brenda was hauled away to the county jail in a flurry of flashing red and blue lights, I didn't feel relief. I felt anticipation. I turned around, walked back up the wooden steps of my porch, and pulled a heavy waterproof blueprint tube out from behind the pillar. Marcus watched me, a knowing grin spreading across his face. Inside that tube was a legally certified, court-approved utility easement survey that had been sitting in my safe for over a year. You see, 2 years ago, when the developers first broke ground on Whispering Pines, they wanted a grand sweeping entrance, automated irrigation for their common areas, and a high-pressure municipal water hookup. And Brenda, in her infinite wisdom, decided that the best place to route their multi-thousand-dollar water main and utility lines was straight through my acreage, ignoring the actual historical utility maps of my family's farm. She hadn't just placed a few red flags on my property. She had buried their primary community water distribution pipes squarely across my land, directly intersecting my private livestock supply. And just 5 minutes before the sheriff arrived, the backhoe bucket didn't just nick the dirt. It completely cracked open their main supply line, flooding their own trench with water pumped directly from their own subdivision meters. They had destroyed their own infrastructure while trying to steal mine. And now that Brenda was sitting in a holding cell facing felony charges, there was no one left to hide the truth from the rest of the neighborhood. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the emergency group chat for Whispering Pines was melting down into absolute, unadulterated chaos. Word had already rippled through the ultra-luxury subdivision like wildfire. Their fearless, tyrannical HOA president had been hauled away in handcuffs by the county sheriff after committing a literal felony. But that wasn't even the worst news hitting the residents. The real nightmare began when the county surveyor and I walked right out to the front entrance of their pristine subdivision, carrying 2 heavy iron padlocks and a formal legal notice. Within minutes, 3 frantic members of the HOA board came speeding down the main street in their luxury European SUVs, slamming on their brakes and piling out into the gravel. They looked like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. "Wait, wait, wait! Stop right there!" shouted Arthur, the vice president of the board, waving his hands frantically as he jogged toward us. He was a high-powered corporate lawyer, but right now he looked like a panicked toddler. "What is the meaning of this? You can't just padlock the neighborhood utility and water connection." Marcus stepped up beside me, flashing his official badge just so there was zero confusion about who was running the show. "Actually, Arthur, he can," Marcus said smoothly, "because that water line, the main distribution pipe, and the land they sit on don't belong to Whispering Pines." Arthur blinked, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the summer breeze. "That's ridiculous. The developers laid these pipes 2 years ago. It's part of our approved subdivision utility plan." I unrolled the certified county survey right across the hood of my truck, pointing directly to the official property pins and utility markers hidden beneath their manicured landscaping. "Your developers cut corners to save a buck," I told him, my voice completely level. "They didn't pay for an independent easement survey. They just guessed where the property line was and buried a massive commercial water main straight onto my family's generational ranch." I tapped the legal document with my finger. Every single inch of that water line, the automated valves, and the hookups feeding your community landscaping site entirely on Parcel A, my land. The color completely vanished from Arthur's face. He looked at the ground where the trench had flooded, then at the survey, and then back at me. The mathematical realization hit him like a brick wall. Because the utility line was permanently built onto private property without a legal easement, it legally belonged to the landowner, to me. You're cutting off our water supply," Arthur whispered, horror dawning in his eyes. 80 multi-million-dollar homes. No community water pressure until this is resolved. "Correct," I replied with a calm smile. "Which means you've been illegally siphoning water across my property line this entire time." The rest of the board members arrived just in time to hear that little nugget of information. Instantly, the high and mighty corporate executives dissolved into a chorus of desperate begging and panic. They knew that if word got out to the rest of the neighborhood that their water supply had been legally severed due to corporate trespassing, property values would instantly plummet to 0. They didn't want to fight. They wanted to negotiate. And negotiation with a pissed-off rural property owner isn't cheap. By the following week, the Whispering Pines board held an emergency neighborhood meeting. Without Brenda there to bully them, the residents voted overwhelmingly to strip her of all remaining authority and throw her completely under the bus. They also voted to accept my terms to avoid a catastrophic legal Instead of forcing them to dig up and relocate their entire multi-thousand-dollar water main, I allowed them to keep it, under one condition. Since they wanted to destroy my private livestock lines and fine me for existing, I decided to return the favor on a corporate scale. The HOA was forced to pay a massive, non-negotiable 7-cylinder permanent utility easement fee directly to me, giving them legal permission to run their water through my dirt. The payout completely obliterated their reserve funds, forcing a crushing special assessment fee on every single household in Whispering Pines. Brenda's reign of terror ended in total financial and social ruin. Facing a felony assault charge and a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit from her own neighbors for gross negligence, she was forced to sell her luxury mansion at a massive loss and leave the county in complete disgrace. As for me, I used the HOA's hard-earned cash to completely upgrade my family's well system, build a brand new workshop, and secure water rights that will last for generations. Whenever I see a luxury SUV drive past my pasture while watering their green lawns, I just smile, knowing that every single one of my wealthy neighbors is essentially paying me a monthly water tax just to keep their grass alive.